The wind in Redemption's Gulch was a thief. It stole the warmth from a man's bones and the hope from his heart, leaving behind nothing but a fine grit of dust that settled in the lines of his face and the folds of his soul. It was a constant, keening presence that scoured the clapboard buildings until they were the color of bone and whipped the single dusty street into a churning river of oakum misery. In this place, survival was a transaction, and compassion was a currency too dear for any to afford. Thane knew this wind. He lived above it, in the jagged teeth of the mountains that bit at the sky, but he came down into it when necessity demanded. He was a man carved from the same hard granite as the peaks he called home, his face a landscape of quiet grief and grim resolve. A bounty poster in the marshal's office bore a crude sketch of that face, attributing to it sins that were and were not his own. The price was enough to make a desperate man bold, but one look at the real Thane was usually enough to make him reconsider. There was a stillness in his grey eyes that spoke of a finality few men were eager to test. He was in the gulch for salt, flour, and cartridges, his business conducted with the same spare economy of motion he applied to all things. He spoke only when necessary, his voice a low rumble like rocks shifting deep underground. He paid in raw gold dust, weighed and confirmed by the grudging storekeeper, and ignored the sideways glances and hushed whispers that followed him like a shroud. He was a ghost in their midst, a reminder of the violence that lay just beyond the thin veneer of their hard-scrabble civilization. As he secured his supplies to the pack mule tethered outside the general store, a movement near the water trough caught his eye. It was a boy, no older than 10, small for his age, with a face made of sharp angles and shadowed hollows. The boy's clothes were the worn, patched garb of a labourer's son, but the fine dark hair and the shape of his eyes marked him as one of the Chinese workers who had laid the tracks and dug the mines, only to be left stranded when the work dried up or the prejudice boiled over. The boy stood with a stillness that mirrored Thane's own, his gaze fixed not on the outlaw but on the ground a few feet in front of him. He was a pillar of desperate calm in the swirling dust. Thane had seen him before, a fleeting shadow at the edge of town, one of two brothers left orphaned when their father, a laundryman named Chen, had succumbed to a lung fever that winter. The town had offered its usual charity, nothing. Thane finished his knot and turned to leave. It was not his concern. The world was full of orphans and sorrows, and he carried more than his own share. He had built walls around his heart for a reason, each stone a memory of a wife's smile and a son's laughter, now silenced by a plague that had swept through his old life like a prairie fire. Solitude was his penance and his shield. He took a step, the leather of his boots creaking a complaint. "Please, sir." Voice was small, thin as a reed, but it cut through the howl of the wind. Thane stopped, but he did not turn. He had learned long ago that turning was the first step toward engagement, and engagement was a path that led only to pain. The boy took a few shuffling steps closer. Thane could feel the proximity, a small, fragile heat against the cold wall of his back. The whispers from the doorways of the saloon and the mercantile faded, replaced by a charged silence. The town was watching. They smelled a drama, a distraction from the endless monotony of their own bleak lives. "Sir," the boy repeated, his English careful and precise, earned from a mission school in a forgotten city. His mountains, his refuge, he could be there by nightfall, Back in the silence where the world could not touch him, he just had to keep walking. But the boy was persistent. He moved around, placing himself directly in Thane's line of sight. His face was pale beneath its layer of grime, his dark eyes enormous, holding a depth of gravity that no child should possess. He did not look afraid, only resolved. "Go away, boy," Thane said, his voice rough from disuse. "I have nothing for you." "I do not ask for charity," the boy said, lifting his chin. It was a gesture of pride so profound in its context that it was almost painful to witness. "I know who you are. The men in town, they whisper. They say you are a hunter. They say you are not afraid." Thane's hand rested on the worn stock of the rifle sheathed beside his saddle. The boy's eyes flickered to the hand, then back to Thane's face, unafraid. "I need food," the boy stated, his voice trembling slightly, the first crack in his stoic facade. "My brother, and he is sick. He has not eaten in a week." Thane's gaze hardened. He looked past the boy, at the leering faces peeking from the saloon, at the storekeeper who had just taken his gold, but now stood with his arms crossed, smirk on his face. This was a spectacle for them, the little Chinese stray begging from the wanted killer. It was a fine piece of frontier theater. "The town has a church," Thane said, his tone flat. "A marshal." "The church door is locked to us," the boy replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The marshal told us to leave the town. He said we are vagrants. Mr. Croft, he says we owe him my father's debt. He says we must work for him in the mine, but Anne is too small. He will die there." The name Croft landed like a stone in the dust. Silas Croft owned the mine, the saloon, and half the souls in Redemption's Gulch. He was a man who measured life in ounces of gold and columns in a ledger. Thane knew of him, had seen the way men flinched when he passed. He was the law here in all the ways that mattered. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced Thane's defences. His own son, Liam, pale with fever, his small hand clutching Thane's finger. "I'm hungry, Papa." The words echoed across the chasm of years, spoken in a voice Thane had tried desperately to forget. He looked down at the Chinese boy, at the fierce, desperate hope in his eyes, and something inside him, a lock rusted shut by years of grief, groaned in protest. He reached into the saddlebag and pulled out a slab of jerky and a small, dense loaf of bread he had just purchased. He did not offer it. He tossed it onto the ground between them. The boy did not flinch. He simply bent, picked up the food, and tucked it carefully inside his shirt. He looked up at Thane, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Thane thought the boy would thank him, but he did not. Instead, he gave a single formal bow from the waist, a gesture of respect that was so out of place, so dignified, that it shamed the gawking townspeople more than any curse could have. Then the boy turned and walked away, not running, but moving with a deliberate pace, down a narrow alley between the blacksmith and the assayer's office. Thane watched him go. He should have mounted his horse. The transaction was complete. He had provided a meal, nothing more, a fleeting impulse, a ghost of a ghost. But he did not move. He saw the small, straight back disappear into the shadows, and he thought of the other one, the one named Anne, sick and starving in some forgotten hovel. He thought of Silas Croft and his ledgers. He let out a breath, a ragged curse against his own weakness. With a soft click of his tongue, he led the horse and the mule not toward the mountains, but down the alley where the boy had vanished. The whispers of the town followed him, but for the first time in a long time he did not care. The wind still blew, but now it seemed to be pushing him forward into a trouble he had not sought but could no longer ignore. The alley reeked of stale beer and desperation. It opened into a small, forgotten pocket behind the main street, a place of refuse heaps and collapsing lean-tos. The boy, Wei, was waiting for him beside the dilapidated shell of what had once been a laundry. The windows were boarded, the door hanging from a single hinge. It was less than a shelter. Wei looked at Thane, his expression a mixture of surprise and trepidation. He had not expected to be followed. He gestured toward the broken doorway. Thane dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his senses on high alert. This could be a trap, a desperate ploy to lure him in for the bounty. But one look at the boy's earnest, worried face told him otherwise. This was something far more raw and dangerous than simple greed. He pushed aside the broken door and stepped into the gloom. The interior was a single small room, stripped of everything valuable. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and poverty. In the far corner, on a pile of rags that served as a bed, lay another boy, smaller than the first. This was Anne. His face was flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and ragged. His eyes were closed, and he shivered, despite the oppressive stillness of the air. He was a flickering candle flame, moments from being extinguished. Wei knelt beside his brother, breaking off a tiny piece of the bread and trying to press it to Anne's lips. The sick boy whimpered and turned his head away. Wei's shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked up at Thane, his composure finally shattering, his eyes filling with tears he refused to let fall. Thane stood in the center of the room, a large, solid shadow in the dim light. The sight of the sick child was a physical blow. It was Liam all over again. The fever, the weakness, the helplessness. A cold rage began to smolder in his gut. It was a rage directed at the town, at Silas Croft, at a God who would allow children to suffer like this. But most of all, it was a rage directed at himself, for the weakness that had made him follow, for the memories that now held him captive. He said nothing. He turned, walked back out into the biting wind and went to his pack mule. He unstrapped a heavy wool blanket and his own waterskin. Returning to the hovel, he knelt beside the sick boy and flinched away from the large, calloused hand that reached for him. But Thane's touch was surprisingly gentle as he felt the boy's forehead. It was burning. Fever, he grunted, the word a diagnosis and a sentence. He looked at Wei. How long? 3 days, Wei whispered. He coughs. He will not drink. Ain knew this path. He had walked it before every agonizing step. It ended in a small hand-dug grave on a wind-swept hill. He stood up, his decision made before he was even conscious of it. The past was a ghost he could not outrun, but perhaps this time he could face it down. Pack nothing, he said to Wei. There is nothing here to pack. He bent, and, with an ease that belied the turmoil inside him, he gathered the small, feverish body of Anne into his arms. The boy was weightless, a bundle of hot, frail bones. Thane wrapped him tightly in the wool blanket, shielding his face from the wind. Wei stared, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning hope. Where are we going? My cabin, Thane said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He will die here. He might die there. But the air is cleaner. He strode out of the hovel without a backward glance. He placed the bundled child carefully in the saddle of his horse, securing him against his own body. He then looked at Wei, who had followed him out, a small, lost figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. "You ride the mule," Thane commanded. He helped the boy up, then mounted his own horse, settling the sick child gently in front of him. He did not look back at Redemption's Gulch. He spurred the horse forward, leading the mule, and set a steady pace toward the high ridges, toward the granite silence of his self-imposed exile. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a man carrying the fragile, uncertain weight of a future that was not his own. The wind howled behind them, as if trying to reclaim the two small souls Thane had just stolen from its grasp. The journey to Thane's cabin was an ascent into a different world. They left the flat, dusty misery of the gulch behind, climbing through switchbacks carved into hills dotted with sagebrush and juniper. The air grew thinner, cleaner, smelling of pine and cold stone. The world below became a hazy memory, a smudge of failure in the vastness of the territory. Thane rode in silence, his body a shield for the sick child in his arms. Every ragged breath Anne took was a painful echo. Every shiver that ran through the boy's small frame was a phantom touch from a past he had buried. He had come to these mountains to be alone with his ghosts, to let them consume him in peace. Now he had invited two new living ones into his sanctuary. It was a fool's act, a betrayal of the vow of numbness he had made to himself. Wei, perched atop the mule, was a silent observer. He watched the broad, unyielding back of the man in front of him. He saw the way Thane instinctively adjusted the blanket around Anne, the way his hand would rest for a moment on the boy's back, as if checking for a heartbeat. This was not the fearsome killer of the whispers. This was something else, something harder to understand. Wei's fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious, fragile trust. They arrived as the sun bled its last colors across the western sky. The cabin was nestled in a small hidden valley, protected by a stand of ancient pines and the sheer granite face of the mountain behind it. It was not a home, it was a fortress, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, with a low roof and a single stone chimney. It seemed to have grown from the earth itself. Smoke curled from the chimney, a testament to the embers Thane had banked before leaving. Inside, the cabin was as stark and functional as the man who had built it. A single room held a stone hearth, a rough plank table with one chair, and a cot built into the wall. Tools and traps hung neatly from pegs, and a well-oiled rifle rested on a rack above the fireplace. There were no comforts, no decorations, no hint of a life beyond mere existence. It was the den of a hibernating bear, a place to wait out a long winter of the soul. Thane laid and gently on his own cot, the only soft surface in the cabin. The boy's fevered eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused and confused, before closing again. Thane stoked the fire, adding logs until it blazed, chasing the chill from the corners of the room. He filled the kettle with water from a barrel and set it on the hearth to boil. Wei stood awkwardly by the door, clutching the piece of jerky, unsure of his place. He was an intruder here, a witness to a private world. "Sit," Thane said, gesturing to the floor by the fire. He did not look at the boy, his attention focused on his tasks. Wei sat, pulling his knees to his chest. He watched as Thane moved about the cabin. The big man was surprisingly quiet, his actions efficient and precise. He shaved slivers of willow bark into a cup, his knife moving with practiced skill. He crushed dried herbs in a small stone bowl. He was preparing a remedy, his brow furrowed in concentration. For the next 3 days the cabin became a crucible. Anne's fever raged, pulling him into a delirium of muttered phrases in a language Thane did not understand. Thane worked tirelessly, a grim-faced nurse. He forced spoonfuls of the bitter willow bark tea between the boy's cracked lips. He bathed his small body with cool water, fighting the fire that consumed him from within. He sat through the long nights watching, listening to the labored breathing that was the only sound in the vast mountain silence, besides the crackle of the fire and the cry of the wind. During this vigil, Thane's walls began to crumble. In the fevered face of the Chinese boy, he saw his son, Liam. The dark hair became blonde, the delicate features became freckled. He found himself murmuring the same soothing words he had whispered to his own child in a different lifetime, the English syllables feeling strange and clumsy on his tongue after so long. Wei was his shadow, his silent acolyte. He learned to anticipate Thane's needs, holding the cup steady, fetching fresh water, adding wood to the fire without being asked. He ate the broth Thane prepared for him, a thin, savory soup made from a snared rabbit, and watched the outlaw with an intensity that missed nothing. He saw the exhaustion in the man's eyes, the deep lines of sorrow etched around his mouth. He saw the gentleness in the rough hands as they tended to his brother. He was seeing the man behind the myth, and his childish allegiance, born of desperation, began to deepen into something profound and unshakable. On the third night, the crisis came. Anne's breathing grew alarmingly shallow, a faint rasp in his chest. A rattling sound started with every exhale. Thane recognized it instantly. The same that had taken the boy's father, the same that had ravaged his own family. A wave of cold despair washed over him. He was failing again. The past was repeating itself, a cruel, mocking echo in this lonely cabin. He stood and walked to the cabin door, pushing it open to the frigid night air. The stars were a spray of cold diamonds against black velvet. He needed to breathe to escape the suffocating grip of the memory. He had failed. He had failed Liam. He was failing this boy, this stranger. A small hand touched his arm. He looked down to see Wei standing beside him, his small face etched with a wisdom far beyond his years. He simply stood there, a silent statement of shared struggle. He was not blaming Thane. He was with him. Something shifted in Thane. The despair did not vanish, but it was joined by a flicker of something else. He would not fail this time. He could not. He turned back into the cabin, his purpose renewed. He crushed more herbs, a pungent mix he had learned from a Ute wanderer years ago. He brewed a strong, steaming concoction, and holding it upright, forced the boy to inhale the vapor, covering their heads with a blanket to form a small tent. He worked through the night, a desperate battle against a relentless foe. Wei stayed by his side, wiping Anne's face, murmuring his name in their native tongue. As the first pale light of dawn crept into the valley, Anne's breathing began to change. The rattling lessened, replaced by a deeper, more regular rhythm. The heat radiating from his skin began to subside. He coughed, a deep, productive sound this time, and his eyes opened. They were clear. He looked from Thane to his brother, his gaze lucid. "Wei," he whispered, his voice weak but his own. Wei let out a choked sob, a sound of pure relief, and threw his arms around his little brother. Thane stepped back from the cot, his shoulders slumping. He felt a weariness so profound it went to the bone. He had won, or at least he had not lost. He watched the two brothers, a knot of emotion tightening in his throat. He had forgotten what this felt like, this fragile, fierce thing called hope. He turned away, busying himself at the hearth, giving them their moment. He felt like an intruder again, a witness to a bond he could never share. But when he glanced back, Wei was looking at him. The boy's eyes were shining with unshed tears, but his expression was one of profound, unutterable gratitude. He bowed his head, a simple gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. In the quiet aftermath of the fever, a new rhythm established itself in the cabin, and recovered slowly, his strength returning in small increments. Thane hunted and fished, providing a steady supply of meat. Wei, with a solemnity that was both touching and heartbreaking, took over the domestic duties. He swept the floor with a makeshift broom of pine needles, washed their few bowls in the creek, and mended Thane's worn shirt with thread pulled from his own clothes. He was earning their keep, proving their worth. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a growing understanding. They learned to communicate through gestures and a handful of shared words. Thane would point to a bird and say, "Jay." Wei would repeat the word, then point to the rice Thane had bought and say, "Ma." It was a slow, patient exchange, the building of a bridge across a vast cultural and linguistic divide. Thane found himself watching the boys. He watched Anne, now strong enough to sit by the fire, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife Thane had given him. Watched Wei as he painstakingly tried to replicate his father's recipe for rice, his brow furrowed in concentration. They were bringing life into his stone and timber tomb. The cabin began to smell of cooking food and wood smoke, not just solitude and old grief. He found a small, intricate carving of a bird on his table one morning, left there by Anne. He found his worn boots, cleaned of mud and oiled, set by the hearth. These small, silent offerings were chipping away at the ice around his heart, but the world below had not forgotten them. One afternoon, as Thane was skinning a deer near the tree line, he caught the scent of unfamiliar horses and cheap tobacco on the wind. He froze, his senses screaming a warning. He melted back into the shadows of the pines, his rifle in his hand, and moved silently toward a rocky outcrop that overlooked the trail to his cabin. Two men were riding up the path. They were rough men, hired muscle, their faces stamped with the casual cruelty of their trade. Thane recognized them as Silas craftsmen. They were not subtle. They were trackers, but clumsy ones. Following the obvious trail he had left when he brought the boys up the mountain, he watched as they reined in their horses before the cabin. He saw the flicker of movement as Wei pulled Anne inside and barred the door. Good boy, Thane thought. He's learning. The men dismounted, their spurs jingling. One of them, a burly man with a florid face, pounded on the door. "We know you're in there, you little rats. Croft sent us, says you've got a debt to pay." The door remained shut. The man kicked it, the wood groaning in protest. "Come on out! Don't make us burn this shack down around you." Thane raised his rifle, stock cool and familiar against his cheek. He centered the sight on the man's chest. It would be an easy shot, too easy. Killing them would bring the full weight of Croft's power and the law. Down on this mountain, it would end this fragile peace forever. There had to be another way. He shifted his aim. He took a steadying breath, let it out, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report cracked through the valley, echoing off the granite cliffs. The heavy slug slammed into the wooden doorframe, just inches from the man's head, sending a shower of splinters into his face. The man yelled in shock and pain, stumbling backward, clutching his cheek where a splinter had cut him. His partner, who had been laughing, was now frantically trying to draw his pistol. A second shot rang out. This one kicked the pistol from the second man's hand, sending it spinning into the dirt. "Leave!" Thane's voice boomed from the rocks above, amplified by the natural bowl of the valley. It was the voice of the mountain itself, cold and unforgiving. Now, the two men stared up at the rocks, their faces pale. They could see nothing but shadow and stone, but they had heard the voice and felt the deadly accuracy of the rifle. They scrambled for their horses, their bravado completely gone. The first man, still bleeding from his cheek, hauled himself into the saddle. "You'll pay for this, whoever you are," he shouted, his voice thin and reedy. "Croft will hear about this." He wheeled their horses around and galloped back down the trail, a panicked, clumsy retreat. Thane watched them go, his face grim. He had not killed them, but he had declared war. This was no longer just about sheltering two orphans. He had defied Silas Croft. He had made a stand. He ejected the spent cartridges, the metallic clicks loud in the sudden silence. The peace was broken. Croft would be back, and next time he would not send fools. The days that followed the confrontation were taut with a new tension. The quiet peace of the valley was gone, replaced by a watchful silence. Thane no longer hunted far from the cabin. He taught Way how to set snares in the nearby woods and how to read the signs of the forest. He showed him how to use a knife, not just for whittling, but for defense, how to hold it, how to find the vulnerable points on a man. The lessons were grim, practical, and necessary. Way absorbed them with a somber intensity, his childhood falling away with each passing day. Thane knew Croft would not let the insult stand. A man like Croft built his empire on fear and the perception of absolute power. To be defied by an unseen gunman and have his men sent running was a challenge to his very foundation. It was a matter of time. The waiting ended a week later. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the valley floor. Thane was sharpening his axe on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a counterpoint to the gentle murmur of the creek. Anne was inside, sketching charcoal figures on a piece of smoothed bark. While Way was checking the snares, a single rider appeared on the trail below. It was the town marshal, a man named Cobb, whose spine was as flexible as his income required. But he was not alone. Behind him rode Silas Croft, immaculate in a black coat and hat, his face a mask of cold fury, and behind them 4 more of cross-hired guns, their hands resting on their holstered pistols. Thane did not reach for his rifle. He simply set down the axe and the stone and stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. He had known this was coming. Running was no longer an option. He had made his choice the moment he turned down that alley in Redemption's Gulch. Way came running from the woods, his face pale with alarm. "Thane!" "Inside." "Way," Thane said, his voice calm and low. "Bar the door. Keeping away from the window. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." Way hesitated, his eyes torn between obedience and the desire to stand with the man who had saved them. "Go," Thane commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Way nodded once, a soldier accepting his orders, and ran into the cabin. The heavy bar slid into place with a solid thud. Thane stood alone in the clearing as the riders approached. He was 1 man against 6, but he stood as if rooted to the mountain itself, immovable and unafraid. Croft and his men reined in their horses a dozen yards away. Marshal Cobb, looking deeply uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Thane," Cobb said, avoiding his eyes, "there's a complaint been filed. Mr. Croft here says you're holding his property. 2 Chinese boys indentured to him to pay off their father's debt. They're not property," Thane said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "They're children." Silas Croft leaned forward in his saddle, his lips curled into a sneer. "The law is the law. I have a contract signed by their father. They belong to me until the debt is settled. I've come to collect what is mine." He looked around at the small, defiant homestead. "And to deal with the squatter who interfered. This is my land," Thane stated flatly. "Filed and claimed. I'm no squatter." "A claim can be challenged," Croft said smoothly, "especially for a man with a price on his head, a man wanted for robbery and murder." Thane's grey eyes locked with Croft's. "I never robbed anyone. And the man I killed drew on me first. He was your man, Croft, trying to burn out a homesteader whose land you wanted." A flicker of surprise crossed Croft's face, quickly masked. "Lies. You're a killer, and now you're a kidnapper. Give me the boys, Thane, or the marshal here will have to add resisting arrest to your list of charges. We'll see you hang." Marshal Cobb shifted in his saddle, his hand hovering near his gun. He was a pawn in this game, and he knew it. Thane stood his ground. The moment had arrived. The final choice. He could surrender the boys, trade their lives for a chance to escape, to run again, to disappear back into his solitude. The thought was a bitter poison. He looked at the cabin, at the sturdy door behind which 2 small lives were huddled in fear, trusting him. He thought of the grave on the hill, the promise he had failed to keep. He would not fail again. "The boys stay here," Thane said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "They are under my protection." Croft laughed a short, ugly bark. "Your protection? You are a dead man walking. You have nothing. I have a rifle in that cabin that can put a hole in you before you clear leather," Thane said, his gaze unwavering. "And I have the will to use it. You want the boys, Croft. You'll have to come through me. And I promise you, some of you won't be riding back down this mountain." The hired guns tensed, their eyes darting between Thane and their employer. They were paid to be tough, but they were not paid to die. They had heard the stories about Thane. They had seen the splintered doorframe and their friend's bleeding face. They saw the look in his eyes now, a look that promised a swift and bloody end. Croft's face darkened with rage. He was not used to being defied. "Marshal, do your duty, arrest him." Marshal Cobb swallowed hard. He looked at the lone, resolute figure of Thane. He looked at the dark, silent cabin. He looked at the nervous faces of Croft's men. He was a corrupt man, but he was not a suicidal one. He could see the truth of the situation. Thane would not be taken easily, and Cobb's life was worth more to him than Croft's contract. "Now, Silas," Cobb began, his voice placating, "let's not be hasty. The man's on his own land. Maybe we can talk this through." "Talk?" Croft spat, his fury turning on the marshal. "I own you, Cobb. You'll do as I say." Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open. Way stepped out, holding the small carving knife Thane had given him. He stood beside Thane, a tiny warrior beside a granite giant. His face was set, his knuckles white around the handle of the knife. "We are not his property," Way said, his voice clear and steady, ringing with a courage that shamed every armed man there. We are a family." The word hung in the air. Family. It was a declaration, a truth spoken into existence. It changed everything. Thane looked down at the boy, a fierce, protective pride swelling in his chest. He put a hand on Way's shoulder. "You heard him," Thane said to Croft, his voice resonating with a new authority. "This is our home. Get off our land." The standoff was absolute. The hired guns were not moving. The marshal was actively backing his horse away. Croft sat there, his face contorted with impotent rage, his power broken against the wall of one man's will and one boy's courage. He had lost. He had been publicly humiliated in front of his own men. With a venomous curse, Croft wrenched his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around so sharply it reared. "This isn't over, Thane. That bounty on your head just doubled. Every man in this territory will be hunting you. You and your little pets will never know a moment's peace." He spurred his horse and galloped down the trail, his men and the relieved marshal following in his wake. Thane stood watching until they were out of sight, the dust settling in their wake. The threat was gone for now. But Croft's final words were a promise. They could not stay here. This sanctuary was no longer safe. He looked down at Way, his hand still on the boy's shoulder, and came out of the cabin running to his brother's side. The three of them stood together in the clearing, a strange and unlikely clan, bound not by blood, but by a shared crucible of loss and survival. The victory was real, but its cost was their home. In the quiet aftermath, a profound change settled over the cabin. The immediate danger had passed, but Croft's parting threat echoed in the silence of the valley. This place, once a refuge, was now a target. The bounty on Thane's head was no longer a dormant fact, a relic of a past he had tried to outrun. It was an active, hungry thing that would draw men like wolves. That evening they ate in near silence, but it was a comfortable shared quiet. Thane watched the brothers. He saw how Way made sure Anne had the best pieces of roasted rabbit, how Anne saved a portion of his meagre meal and offered it to Thane. These were the small, unspoken rituals of a family, rituals that had been absent from Thane's life for so long he had forgotten their warmth. After the meal, as the fire crackled and threw dancing shadows on the log walls, Thane laid his plans bare. "We cannot stay," he said, his voice low. "Croft will send others, not men like those. He will send bounty hunters. Killers." Way looked up from the fire, his young face serious. He did not question the decision. He'd seen the look in Croft's eyes. He nodded slowly. "Where will we go?" "West," Thane said. It was the only answer that had ever mattered on the frontier west, toward the setting sun, toward lands that were wilder, less settled, where a man and his family might be able to disappear. Over the mountains, Oregon maybe, or further north, a place where the name Silas Croft means nothing. Anne, who had been listening intently, looked from Thane to his brother. "Together?" he asked, the single word full of a child's hope and fear. Thane looked at the small boy, at the wide, trusting eyes, the knot in his own chest, the one that had been there since Ilara and Liam had died, seemed to loosen just a little more. He reached out and rested his large calloused hand on Anne's head. "Together," he confirmed. The word felt right. It felt solid. They spent the next day preparing. There was not much to pack. Thane gathered his tools, his traps, and a good supply of ammunition. He packed dried meat, flour, and salt. Way, with solemn efficiency, packed their few belongings: the wool blanket, the cooking pot, the carving knife, and Anne's charcoal sketches, which he wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth. They were taking their home with them. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting the valley in a soft, golden light, they were ready. The pack mule was loaded heavier now with the weight of their shared future. Thane's horse stood ready, saddled and patient. Thane took one last look around the cabin. It was just a box of wood and stone again, stripped of the life they had brought to it, but it had served its purpose. It had been more than a shelter. It had been a place of healing, a place where 3 broken souls had begun to mend. He would not miss the place, but he would remember what had happened here. He turned to the boys. He lifted Anne and set him on the mule's back, nestled securely between the packs. He looked at Way. "We will take turns walking and riding the horse," he said. "It will be a long journey." Way nodded, his gaze steady. He was ready. Thane mounted his horse, then reached down a hand to Way. He pulled the boy up to sit in front of him, just as he had done with Anne on that first desperate day. He settled the boy against him, small, warm presence, against the vast emptiness he had carried for so long. He nudged the horse forward, leading the mule out of the clearing and onto the trail. They did not head down, back toward Redemption's Gulch and the world of men like Croft. They turned upward toward a high, little-used pass that would take them over the spine of the mountains. As they climbed, the valley fell away below them, a darkening pool of shadow. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, but inside the circle of Thane's arms, Way was sheltered, and wrapped in the blanket on the mule's back was a small, resilient bundle. They did not look back. Their pasts were landscapes of ash and sorrow, in a laundryman's hovel and a lonely grave on a hill. Their future was an unknown territory, a blank map waiting to be written. But they faced it together, the outlaw, the orphan, and the sick boy who had survived. 3 solitary figures against the immense, indifferent beauty of the frontier, moving steadily west toward the last light of the day, a new family forged in fire and hope, searching for a place to call their own.